Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. In this episode, I take a presentation I gave at another event that was not recorded and present it here. It's entitled ICS-Patch, What to Patch When in ICS Security. And we'll have that in just a second. But before we get there, I wanted to let you know that the S4X22 call for presentations, the CFP, is now open. You can see it at s4xevents.com/CFP, and we'll include a link in the show notes. One of the things I tried to do there was I created a video that will tell you what we're looking for and improve your chances of getting accepted. We actually have a list of tips there that says this is what will help you get accepted, and then a list of tips. This is what will probably cause your proposal to be rejected. So if you haven't been to S4, it's a different event. I'd really encourage you, first of all, to come, but we'd also like to get the best work up on stage. So if you're going to submit something, watch the video. One other note, if you don't have something to submit, but you can think of something that will help create the future. So maybe this is a brilliant researcher, a project, a good speaker, a topic that we should chase. I'd appreciate a heads up on that. We get some tips every year that lead to great S4 sessions. You can send those to s4@digitalbond.com. And with that as an intro, let's get to the presentation. This is very exciting. So the title of this presentation is Never Next Now. What to patch when in ICS. And to begin with, I'd like to address this term that I hear a lot of, and I have actually done a whole podcast episode on it called cyber hygiene. It seems like this is what the community is increasingly obsessed with. They're saying, what are the basic things I need to do to have this magical term hygiene? And when you think about it, it's actually brilliant marketing, because who could be against hygiene? Except for maybe me. Because we're not in a competition to see who can have the best cyber hygiene or who can implement the most good practice security controls. It's not that these things are bad, but unless you have unlimited resources, all the money, all the time in the world, then simply following as many good security practices as you want doesn't make a lot of sense. Instead, what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to manage OT-related cyber risk. And importantly, not to manage it down to zero. Okay, companies accept risk all the time across all different areas. The idea is that we have to remove every possible risk from OT cyber is just a fool's errand. First of all, we will never succeed. Second of all, it's not in the best interest of the company to expend all those resources to reduce risk below a certain level. So what we really want to do is we want to identify that risk and then manage it. And in managing it, reduce it down to a level acceptable to executive management, the people who can actually accept cyber risk or any other type of risk. Another way to look at this that I like is McKinsey, the consulting firm, had 4 phases of a cyber maturity or a cyber program based on maturity. The first one was essentially do nothing. Phase 2 was this maturity based. And in this is essentially cyber hygiene. They're saying at this level 2, you are essentially saying, what are all the good things I can do? Let me do of as many of them as possible. And then they say the next step up from that is what I'm talking about here, risk-based. And in that case, you're actually saying, what can I do? How should I spend my resources to manage my risk? Not blindly apply these things that people say are good, but actually intelligently, with a risk-based approach, address that. And I'll include a link to that McKinsey article in the show notes if you need to maybe convince your management why cyber hygiene or the maturity-based approach is not the right one to do. Regular listeners probably are sick of me talking about insecure by design, but it's incredibly important when you're thinking about risk in your ICS or your OT environment, because insecure by design, again, is not a lack of secure by design. It's much worse than that. Insecure by design is this definition here. The protocol, device, or system has documented features that provide the attacker with all they would require to cause the desired impact. No vulnerability or misconfiguration is required by the attacker. Now, if we realize that 95% of our systems in the ICS world are insecure by design, so all your PLCs, they will do whatever they're told. You can change the logic, you can change settings, you can change the speed, you can turn things on and off, and no vulnerability is required because the level 1 device, the PLC or controller, will just accept that command and do whatever it wants. So what is the value of hardening a lot of those things internally if once someone is there, they don't need to find an exploit? And the simplest way to think about insecure by design is access equals compromise. If I have access to an insecure by design device, then I no longer need a vulnerability. All those security controls, all that cyber hygiene you decide to put in place might make you feel good, but from an attacker perspective, once I'm there, I can do whatever I want. So when you think about this, it really changes where you should spend your resources from a risk management standpoint in the OT world. The way that we've been approaching it at Digital Bond for years is this efficient risk reduction approach. We look at all the things that could be done and we say, where will we get the next, or where will we get the most risk reduction for the next dollar or hour we spend on the problem? And we actually rate them. In fact, I recommend this. It was suggested by a client over 15 years ago. They said, what we really need in the report is tell us in a prioritized list the top 5 things we should do in the next 6 months, and then the top 5 things we should do in the next 6 to 18 months. And we started doing that and sorting those by efficient risk reduction. And it's amazing the progress you can make. Just one other note, it would be a whole nother presentation, but when you're looking at this, don't just think about security controls, also think about consequence reduction. I can link to presentations on this as well, but if you can, for example, reduce your maximum confidence from tens of millions of dollars in months of outage to tens of thousands of dollars in hours of outage by better recovery or some sort of protective measure that can't be hacked, well, then that's going to be much more efficient risk reduction than reducing the likelihood from 5% to 4%. Okay, so look at both sides of the risk equation. Now, for the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about security patching, and it is such a great example of how you really need to think about efficient risk reduction, because applying all the security patches across your system will require a tremendous amount of time and money and may not get you the commensurate reduction in risk. So if we look at the security patching problem, there's just a massive amount of activity. Talk to people on the enterprise. They have their hands full trying to keep up with security patching. And it's much more than just the Microsoft vulnerabilities. We see a lot of security patching programs essentially in OT be Microsoft security patching programs. It's all the software. It's the operating system. It's the applications. It's the libraries you don't even know about. There's a tremendous amount of that. And you have this effort now around supply chain called an SBOM, a software bill of materials, where they're actually saying, this is all the software in each one of my cyber assets. And once you understand that, you start to see that you don't just have hundreds of vulnerabilities, you have thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of patches that need to be applied to assets when we look at every asset patch pair. It's overwhelming. If you are going to place all that effort, and I'm not recommending you do, you better get some massive risk reduction for doing it. The other thing that we all know is that you can't just blindly apply these security patches. A lot of times you need vendor approval. There needs to be testing. You do a phased deployment, leveraging your redundancy. So your patch cycle might not be something that you can push things out in hours. You might actually be talking about months. Now, the good news is that virtualization is a huge help with this. As we get more and more things virtualized, it's easier just to roll out a new image or a new container. And then if it doesn't work, roll back to the old one. But it's a very, very large problem. And even when you think about it in terms of ICS, I like to use this analogy of saying, if you're looking at this building and it has all these broken windows, 20, 30 broken windows, about 2/3 are broken, 1/3 are not broken. And imagine those are your security patches. If I apply 4 or 5 patches, if I fix 4 or 5 of those windows, I'm not really doing that much to keep the weather out. I have to patch all or almost all of those windows to really make a difference. So just a little bit of security patching from a risk reduction standpoint might not really achieve that much. But even worse than that, if you look at this like a roof with a bunch of holes in it, that's your insecure by design nature. So if I've got this cyber asset missing all these patches and I go to all the trouble of applying all those patches and maintaining all those patches, if the device is insecure by design, the weather is just going to come through the roof. So you really want to think about when you're applying these patches, what kind of risk reduction am I getting for patching this cyber asset? We looked at this problem a little bit. It was actually a session we had at S4X19. And again, I'll link the video to this, where we had a lot of people complaining about the CVSS score as the metric people were using to determine what to patch. So basically, if it had a high CVSS score, they said, oh, that's important, you need to patch it. Low, you didn't. And nobody likes this because it doesn't include environmental factors and other risk-based factors. Now, the CVSS score doesn't claim it does. You're supposed to judge those separately. But people were using it for that purpose. So we brought 3 people on stage and we said, okay, we know no one likes it, but we can't just say we don't like it. We have to have a better solution. Art Mannion of CERT CC came up with a very interesting solution. They called it TEMSL at the time. They now call it SSVC. But he took the extreme measure. He said, look, the CVSS isn't broken. It's completely worthless. Don't try to fix it. You need to replace it. And again, remember, this is CERT CC. They deal with this every day, and they're saying the CVSS was completely broken. What they were recommending was something that was a decision tree based system. And this decision tree would be based on certain factors that they defined. And out from this decision tree would come an answer, never, next, now. Patch it now, patch it next patching interval, or never patch it. This approach got a lot of buzz. People said, oh, this might be something that actually might work. So what we did is we took what they came out in some modified versions of what they presented at S419. They actually presented SSVC at S420, and we really liked the approach. So we modified their decision tree with ICS-Patch, and we added some ICS features as input. We slightly tweaked never, next, now. It's now defer, basically set it aside, scheduled, your next scheduled outage, or ASAP. So those are the results of the decision tree. But the really key point that where we differed the most is we said, whatever we come up with, there must be a way of automating this decision tree. Because remember, if we've got tens or hundreds of thousands of asset patch pairs, we can't spend a lot of time evaluating which ones fall in each one of those buckets, defer, scheduled, ASAP. It has to be automated. You'll hear me pounding on this point over and over again, because I think this and the decision tree are the 2 key factors. But the whole goal of this approach is for an asset owner to spend the resources on the patches that affect risk and don't spend them on the patches that don't affect risk. Again, this is that risk-based approach. So here's a picture of the decision tree. We're not going to go through all the branches, but the rectangles you see there are the decision points. And then at the end, you see the circles, and you see just by following this decision tree, your answer falls up of what to patch when in ICS. The key thing is the 5 factors, though. So let's go over those 5 factors. First is exposure. This is how exposed is the cyber asset to external or less trusted networks. So if you can directly reach it, obviously your possibility of getting attacked from that external network is much higher. So we have direct, indirect, and small. And I want to point out at each one of these, this is something that doesn't change often. And this is something that can be stored in your asset inventory. So as you're putting in your cyber asset, you say, what's the exposure, direct, indirect, or small? Small would be something isolated. There aren't a lot of small. Most will be indirect. Hopefully a small number will be direct. The next one is really the biggest deviation from what CERT-CC recommended. This is security posture change. And this ties into the insecure by design issue. So the decision here is, if I apply this patch, how much will my security posture change? So imagine I've got a cyber asset that's hardened and patches have been applied on a regular basis, and it's missing a small set of security patches. Well, applying the security patches to that will change its security posture dramatically, because it will go from something that was almost hardened to something that was hardened. On the other end, trivial, if you have a PLC that supports unauthenticated firmware upload and all other sorts of things, applying a patch to that PLC does very little. Okay, so that would be trivial. And then minor is in between that. And again, this would be something that you could be set in your asset inventory and would be unlikely to change over time. Safety impact, straightforward. If this asset is exploited, what is the impact to the safety of my process? Direct means my safety process won't work properly. Indirect is a hop away, and none is self-explanatory. Again, it could be placed in the asset inventory, unlikely to change over time. And process impact, just the same there. You see that the categories are essential failure, essential degraded, non-essential degraded. Again, if this cyber asset, the integrity and availability is not operating properly, what is the impact to my process? And finally, this is the 4th of 5 factors, and all four of these first 4 factors could be in the asset inventory and would be unlikely to change much over time. The last one is technical impact. And in this case, we need something related to each vulnerability that comes out, and we need some way of assigning a value to it. Now, right now, the best we have is CVSS score. I know from the ICS-JWG presentation that DHS CISA did, they are actually thinking about putting out another value, kind of a high, medium, and low, that combines technical impact with exploits in the wild and other factors. And if they did that, I would include that here. The key here, this is something that's going to come out for every vulnerability. You're going to get this value, and it has to be available from a feed. Because the key here is automating the decision. As I said, all 5 factors need to be available, and then they just feed into a program that is the decision tree. And really, the decision tree, the amount of code to code up this decision tree is trivial. It is really easy. So what you would do is you'd have your asset inventory, a CVE feed would come in, and you'd say, oh, do we have this software? Yes. Okay, which cyber assets have it? You'd run it through this decision tree, and out it would spit out all the security patches that fall in the ASAP, scheduled, and defer category. Now, what we've seen in looking at this and making estimates is that only a small percentage are in the ASAP category, maybe 5% or less. Again, this will depend a lot on how well architected your network is. If you're getting a lot that fall in the ASAP category, you probably need to work on your network architecture. Some closing thoughts on this. The key here is whether it's the security patching in this ICS patch that I talked about, or anything else in the big cyber hygiene bucket, you really need to spend your time on what matters. There's so much we have to do in ICS security. We can't spend a lot of time just with good security practices that aren't doing anything to reduce risk. You need to get ahead of this, because if you don't say these are the things that matter and this is our analysis as to why, these good security practices as cyber hygiene is going to get pushed down to you. In the security patching example, the key is to automate the security patching decision and find that small percentage of security patches that actually make a big difference in risk. I can tell you, just looking at the trees, they are going to be primarily those things that are directly exposed and those things that are not insecure by design. Those are the ones that are actually you're going to want to patch, and you're going to want to patch those ASAP. You're going to want to spend your time patching those in hours as opposed to trying to patch everything quarterly. Now, the decision tree that Art Manning and CERT-CC came up with is really some of the magic sauce here. It is a very effective approach. And we've suggested a decision tree in ICS-Patch, but I'm not saying it's the right decision tree for you. You could change the factors. You could change the flow of the decision tree. You could change the number of buckets. It could be 4 buckets instead of 3 that they drop into. But the approach itself, I think, is really solid. Seeing DHS pick it up is a good example that they believe the same. And I will include a link to the ICS-Patch white paper for your consideration. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions on ICS-Patch, you can email them to me at s4@digitalbond.com. That's all for now, and I'll talk to you next time. Something warrants an unsolicited response.